Welcome to Let's Get to Work, Reimagining Disability Inclusive Employment Policy, brought to you by the Burton-Blatt Institute at Syracuse University. And now, here's your host, Michael Morris.
Welcome to yet another episode of Let's Get to Work, Reimagining Disability Inclusive Employment Policy podcast series. This series features guests with unique insights and perspectives on public policy and practices as it is impacting individuals with disabilities, youth and adults, in terms of career advancement, in terms of competitive integrated employment opportunity. I'm so pleased today to have Lydia Brown. Lydia is National Disability Institute's Director of Public Policy, but Lydia does far more than that. And although of a young age, from my perspective, we represent two different generations for sure. Lydia has more than 15 years of experience as a committed advocate, community organizer, and policy expert at the nexus of disability rights and disability justice. Lydia, your voice really brings new meaning and attention to a range of issues impacted by the intersections of disability, sexuality, race, gender, class, and nation. For our listener audience, tell us in your own words, who is Lydia Brown and what identities and experiences have shaped your life?
I've described myself at varying times as a community organizer, as well as a policy expert and an educator and an activist. And all of these roles are important in the work that I do, and yet offer tangibly something very different in terms of what strategies and what tactics are useful and what strategies and tactics are effective in different contexts in advancing societal and cultural transformation, and in turn changing the landscape for disabled people. The work that I do is deeply informed by my own commitments to the disability rights and the disability justice movements, which are not actually the same thing, a bit of a distinction that many people aren't necessarily familiar with. And, people will often make the mistake of trying to conflate those terms. And in reality, they refer to two different, although related, movements for social change and transformation. My work in disability rights seeks to change the landscape of law and policy as it affects disabled people's lives, what laws and policies are in place, the ways in which they are or are not implemented, and the ways in which they might either fail to adequately protect disabled people, and the potential that they could have to further secure an economically just and overall socially just future for people with disabilities. My work in disability justice, apart from disability rights, focuses on societal transformation outside and beyond that which law and policy are able to contemplate. Disability justice as a framework is one that was co-created largely by queer and trans disabled people and disabled people of color, and focuses on the ways in which law and policy will not be sufficient to bring about full justice and liberation for people with disabilities. And so in that vein, my work is also informed by the knowledge that what we do as legal and policy advocates cannot and should not exist divorced from on-the-ground activism and organizing by disabled people at the margins, seeking to upend and to transform the societal structures that give rise to discriminatory, predatory, and harmful laws and policies in the first place.
I think it's a great lead-in to the topic that we're going to spend a majority of our time on today. And that is what is a topic that's, grabbing the headlines regularly, major topic of conversation on social media. And that is about artificial intelligence and algorithms, as they're being used now more than ever in making decisions about hiring and worker performance that particularly can adversely impact individuals with disabilities and increase systemic employment discrimination. Maybe for our audience, which is at probably different levels of understanding about these terms, let's start with some basics. What are algorithms and how are they used in the hiring process?
The word algorithm has become very trendy to talk about in public today. And I unfortunately believe there are a lot of misconceptions around what constitutes an algorithm. We're inclined to think about, like you mentioned, headline grabbing ideas, like computers are making decisions and maybe we'll take over the world. And instead, what constitutes an algorithm is actually a lot simpler than that. An algorithm is any kind of if-then type of operation. It doesn't have to be computerized. There doesn't have to be any software involved at all. An algorithm can be as simple as a paper worksheet that somebody fills out and comes to a type of calculation at the end. And that can be used to inform a decision. It can be used to make a decision. It can be used to make an assessment or an analysis of a situation or of a person. Or it could just be used to make a decision about, for example, where you want to host this year's family reunion based upon, again, a series of if-then type operations. But in our parlance today, we are most often concerned about types of algorithms that inform software platforms and tools. That is, algorithms that are far more complex than a simple paper worksheet that you might use when planning that family reunion. We're thinking about algorithms that inform the development of, for example, what you're describing, tools that employers across all sectors are using to evaluate and screen potential applicants or candidates for jobs, to automate certain components of the traditional recruitment and hiring processes that would have been conventionally handled by human resources professionals or by headhunters, and are now being managed, at least in large part, if not entirely, by algorithmically managed software or tools. And so that could look like, for example, something as basic as a resume screening tool. A candidate sees a posting online, could be for a marketing manager position. It could be for a business consultant job. It could be to work in retail at the mall. It could be to work, in nearly any sector. And they decide, sounds great. I seem like I'm qualified. I'm going to apply to this job. You'll be prompted to upload your resume. And if the company that's hiring has contracted with or has authorized its subcontractor to contract with an algorithm-based software tool to screen the resumes, the candidate may not ever know that their resume isn't going to a person that's going to review the slush pile. Instead, it's going to a computer program that has been instructed through the way it was implemented for this particular hiring process to automatically screen out candidates based on certain characteristics or based on assumptions about certain characteristics. And those characteristics could be anything from if any candidate that has been out of work for a period of longer than 6 months, they have a gap on their resume that exceeds 6 months. Or it could be any candidate that has no mention of the word leadership anywhere on their resume. Or it could be any candidate who, for instance, did not go to a certain type of university or have a certain kind of degree. And you'll automatically rule out those resumes. And in theory, that kind of tool could be really helpful if you are hiring, say, for an inside counsel job, and you need the applicant to be an attorney with an active bar license. It makes sense that anyone who is not an attorney and or does not have an active bar license should just be ruled out. If someone submitted their resume in error, or they didn't read the job description closely, or they were just incredibly overambitious despite not being a lawyer and tried to apply for an inside counsel job, they should be ruled out. And that seems to make sense. In reality, however, resume screening tools, like other more complex and perhaps even more nuanced uses of algorithmic tools, can have an incredibly discriminatory impact. Take the example that I gave of a tool being trained to screen out candidates who have a gap of greater than 6 months on their resume. That could disadvantage anybody who was pregnant and gave birth or adopted a child into their family. It could screen out anyone who's been incarcerated, which is a population of which anywhere from 50 to 80% are people with disabilities. It could screen out people who've struggled with chronic or intermittent homelessness and therefore faced additional systemic barriers to securing employment in the past, including having a permanent address, which is required on most job applications. And we also know that homelessness disproportionately impacts people with disabilities as well. And it can also compound the impact of earlier employment discrimination. If an otherwise qualified candidate, even if they've never given birth, they've never been incarcerated, and they've never been homeless, but have experienced discrimination because of their disability and perhaps because of other characteristics, perhaps their sexual orientation or their race or their religion as well, and they have then had gaps in their employment because of that discriminatory experiences that they have had, then the resume screening tool that was instructed to screen out all candidates who had a gap of 6 months or greater will further the impact of that discrimination and further preclude that person from being considered as a potentially viable candidate to return to the workforce. Now, the other algorithmic tools that recruiters and hiring managers are using are often much more complex than that. They can take the form of outright assessments. They can take the form of software that attempts to analyze keystrokes, vocabulary usage, somebody's facial expressions or eye contact. They can be assessments that ask candidates to play a type of game in order to assess risk-taking behaviors or the speed at which they respond to certain stimuli. And all of these types of tools have the potential to be discriminatory against disabled people, and oftentimes they are, either because they use interfaces or require a user input that is at odds with the ways that some people with disabilities need to access technology and their devices, and because they have an outsized discriminatory impact based on what they are measuring. If it is a tool assessing personality traits, and as has been discovered in many of these tools widely used by employers now, they're assessing a potential candidate's optimism. This could be a factor that works against people with a range of mental health disabilities and is also almost certainly unrelated to a job function or job performance. Optimism is also just unrelated to the ability to, for example, be a successful accountant or business consultant or stop and shop worker. Like, you don't need to be optimistic to do those jobs. But if an algorithmic informed tool is attempting to measure this candidate's optimism as a trait, then it could have a particularly discriminatory impact on workers with disabilities. And it could also be doing so in violation of the law, which prohibits the use of tests in the course of recruiting and hiring a person that are either discriminatory on the basis of disability and or are not actually related to job function while having a potentially discriminatory impact.
So you've laid out really some very concrete examples of where these types of tools really create bias and further disadvantage disabled people. What can you suggest could be done to minimize bias in the development of algorithmic tools that are used all too regularly now in the job screening process?
This is a question that in part asks us whether and when it is appropriate for employers to use AI-based tools, and to what extent it could be possible to use these tools in ways that are not discriminatory. And I would urge employers to consider, firstly, the question of whether it is in fact necessary or all that productive to employ an AI-based tool, one that is making algorithmically informed and at least somewhat automated decisions about potential candidates or about workers who are on the job. And in many cases, I would argue that the answer is no. Employers do not necessarily need to use certain types of algorithmically based tools. And some tools may, in fact, be so harmful and discriminatory that there is no use for them. There's no legitimate use for them, rather. For example, employers who are working in the support center industry are now sometimes using algorithmic-based surveillance tools to evaluate their workers for performance issues, measuring things like the time that workers spend on each call, or the tone of voice that a worker is using, or how polite the worker appears to be. And workers in some call centers have actually experienced workplace discipline and even terminations based on everything from leaving their workstation to use the bathroom to not using language that was considered as appropriate based upon an algorithm that is listening to the audio input of the call, not being sufficiently empathetic or being overly empathetic, for example. And these are frankly inherently subjective measurements that have the potential to be incredibly discriminatory for a range of factors, both related to disability, for example, someone with cerebral palsy that affects the sound and the tenor of their voice, or an autistic person where autism affects the way that they are communicating and engaged in social interaction, as well as a range of factors that may not be directly tied to disability, like class or first language or race, for example, and could potentially penalize workers that are speaking in Black vernacular English, as opposed to workers speaking in white American English instead. And those types of tools, I would argue, are so discriminatory and harmful in the lives of workers that they should not be used. But then the second category of tools are still up for debate. Tools that are not so potentially dangerous, discriminatory, or harmful, that perhaps there could be a legitimate use for them. And in that case, I would turn precisely to the guidance released jointly last year by the EEOC and the Department of Justice that lays out a very basic framework, of course, that can and should be built upon, but essentially urges employers to consider, what is the test actually assessing? Is it narrowly shaped and implemented to assess for those specific factors? And are those factors actually essential to job performance and competency required to perform the job? And is this test as widely usable, accessible, and adaptable to as many potential candidates as possible? And to the extent that it is not, are there equivalent alternatives that can be employed and made available to candidates without singling out disabled candidates, forcing them to disclose, or creating a fundamentally unequal process for the assessment of disabled versus non-disabled candidates? And those are the kinds of questions that employers should consider very carefully when seeking to develop and implement a new algorithmic technology or considering contracting an outside vendor to use theirs.
Lydia, perhaps you have advice for job candidates with a disability. These tools are being used. What options might they have for when faced with these types of tools that could really screen them out? What suggestions do you have in that circumstance?
There are a lot of conversations among candidates for different jobs about how to attempt to work around automated decision making that could have adverse, potentially discriminatory, and unrelated impact on their lives. So, for example, in the context of automated personality testing, which is unfortunately very widely used by many employers, there are many people with disabilities, especially neurodivergent people, who will ask someone who is not disabled, someone who is neurotypical, to take the test instead and answer with their answers. Another common piece of advice is, give the answer that you think the employer wants to hear about this job rather than what actually reflects your true feelings or answer to this question. And those types of advice are certainly very useful, but they boil down to individualizing the problem to what can the disabled person try to do and to having to game a system rather than perhaps changing that system altogether. And of course, when push comes to shove, if you're an individual disabled person and you're applying for a job, chances are it's because you need that job. You need to make money, you're trying to earn that money, and you have bills that you need to pay with that money. And perhaps, like most people, you would also like to be able to do things that are not about paying bills, but that nonetheless money would make possible or at least easier to do. Like, I don't know, go to the movies or take a day trip to the beach or continue paying for your Netflix subscription, right? Like those are all things that require money and theoretically at least some earning capacity. And if you're in that position, you can't wait around for Congress or for federal regulators to act and to issue further regulations around civil rights enforcement on employers' use of AI for recruitment and hiring or for performance evaluation, promotion, and disciplines. You just have to manage to work your way through that system. There are also many conversations, and I'm sure this has come up, for most of us at some point or another, around disclosure and whether and to what extent a candidate for a job or a person who's been newly hired as an employee should request accommodations and disclose a disability. These are protected practices under law. The ADA protects against employment discrimination in hiring as well as on the job. But as we know, simply because something is law does not mean that people with disabilities are in fact meaningfully supported and accommodated in every single job that we have upon disclosure. And that again points us back to the earlier conversation that we had about the difference as well as alignment between the goals of disability rights and those of disability justice. The disability rights movement would urge us to consider how our laws can be strengthened, how enforcement action can become more meaningful and useful for the people who are directly impacted, where there are holes in our laws and our regulations. And at the same time, the disability justice framework reminds us that even if we pass the strongest laws, and the ADA certainly is an incredibly powerful piece of legislation governing the lives of people with disabilities, but even if we have the best possible version of the ADA, if every regulator changes the ways in which they approach disability, meaningfully incorporates disability into every single strategic plan around equity, around civil rights enforcement, and so on, that doesn't necessarily address the cultural and societal factors that gave rise to the systematic discrimination or ableism in the first place. For the individual worker with a disability, it is not possible, and the onus or burden should not be put on them as well to have to solve what is fundamentally a structural and systemic issue born both out of our legal and regulatory scheme, as well as societal and cultural values about disability and bodies and minds. And so at the end of the day, while workers with disabilities need to make very careful and deliberate decisions about whether they will choose to disclose in a particular hiring process, and the conventional wisdom is not to until you've accepted the job offer in writing, that's not going to address the root of the problem, which is that employers still hold all the power. And the vast majority of workers with disabilities on the job or seeking to enter or return to the workforce will not have a reliable way of knowing whether or not a potential employer or a current employer is using an algorithmic-based tool. You will not necessarily know. You will not necessarily be able to figure it out. And just as was true in the analog world before the proliferation of algorithmic-based technology, you will never know for sure, in most cases, whether in fact not being hired was because of disability discrimination or for reasons that weren't discriminatory at all, or, as is likely the case in many situations, for a combination of discriminatory and non-discriminatory reasons. You didn't quite have the qualifications, and they presumed you incompetent based on assumptions about your disability in a way that they wouldn't have treated somebody else who otherwise had the same level of qualifications as you. But can you prove that? Probably not, because most employers are savvy enough not to say in writing or even out loud to you, oh, well, you have this disability, we're not going to hire you. Most employers are cognizant of the potential legal liability of making it clear that they're being discriminatory if in fact they're aware of it to begin with themselves. And then, of course, there are the employers who are not knowingly or intentionally discriminating, but nonetheless are implementing policies or adopting AI-based tools that have a discriminatory impact in disabled people's lives. And so if you don't know as a worker with a disability whether or not a potential or current employer is using this type of tool, then you also won't necessarily know whether you're being discriminated against it. And there really isn't a way for you then to overcome that power imbalance. And that's why I think that the tenor of the conversation has to shift back to corporate and employer responsibility as well as regulatory responsibility.
I'm glad you end there, because it does take us to what is the public policy framework here that can offer better protections for not just job candidates with disabilities, but but other minorities, people of color, women. There are just so many different ways that, as you said, you're not going to know that the algorithmic tool has discriminated against you because I'm not even sure the employer knows all the elements that went into the development of those tools and how it's impacting different vulnerable groups of people. So where can we go in the public policy arena? You mentioned EEOC and justice, but if you had the power and authority, where would you take this discussion in terms of, is it guidance, rules, legislation? What would you do?
We need to have comprehensive civil rights protections that are updated for the digital age, and we do not have those protections. And that's true whether they are focused specifically on disability or whether they're focused on a particular topic area like employment or the governance of algorithmic tools. We do not have a comprehensive regulatory scheme that is updated to address the impact of algorithm-based technologies in contemporary life from a civil rights perspective. And that has to come through congressional action as well as clear regulatory enforcement.
As we look ahead at these subjects, the technology is going to continue to so-called innovate in this arena. What I've been seeing is that there are some cities and states that are looking to protect vulnerable populations from algorithmic decision-making tools. Are there examples that seem to come to mind for you that are going in the right direction? How could they go further? What, is this an arena that can set some guardrails?
One area of major concern is that most policy proposals thus far have relied upon some combination of imposing what are called bias audits, often statistical focused bias audits, or reliance on self-auditing, both of which are incredibly unreliable in general in a civil rights enforcement context, but which are also particularly unproductive and potentially counterproductive, specifically in the context of disability. So a statistical audit is one that looks at statistical outcomes among populations. So for example, what percentage of, say, Asians were hired versus not hired? What percentage of people who disclosed being part of the LGBTQ community were hired versus not? What percentage of people with disabilities made it past the screening or not? And what's unreliable about this method for disability is that, as we know, disability comes in an incredibly diverse array of experiences. There are potentially thousands of conditions that could qualify as a disability under federal non-discrimination law. And even among people who have the exact same condition, the presentation and manifestation of that disability can be infinitely varied as well. And therefore, there is not a clear, reliable way of attempting to statistically account for what percentage of people with disabilities may have experienced an adverse outcome or impact in a way that it is perhaps more possible, although I would argue still imperfect, to calculate that statistic, say, for the Asian and Pacific Islander community. It is a bit more straightforward to determine, is somebody Asian versus not Asian? Although, again, I would argue that there's a bit more nuance to it than that. But it is more straightforward than to determine, was it known that this person had a disability? Did this disability interplay at all with the particular tool or practice being used? And so for that reason, that type of statistical modeling for bias auditing is not helpful. And I would argue it is counterproductive because it can give a false illusion of security, compliance, and therefore alignment with equity goals for employers that are actually acting in incredibly discriminatory ways, but can use an unreliable statistical-based bias audit report to claim that a tool or a practice they've employed is free of discrimination or discriminatory effects when that may not actually reflect reality. But the other problem with proposals, of course, that rely upon self-auditing is that a company that is self-auditing itself, even if well-intentioned, is not going to be able to bring the same perspective, the same external objectivity as any external reviewer would. But that's in the best case scenario. In the worst case scenario, companies, employers, vendors, software developers could simply self-certify and say, well, we looked at, was this biased or not? We don't think it's biased. Therefore, it's not biased. And we are in compliance with this proposed regulation. And that is not productive because, as we know, so many companies may claim to be in favor of improving equity, or, as is now the case, nearly all companies have a diversity, equity, and inclusion department. And yet, people from various marginalized communities continue to file substantiated claims of disability discrimination, race-based discrimination, religious-based discrimination. And that wouldn't be happening if all of the companies that have those very same DEI initiatives and divisions were actually able to take meaningful accountability for the ways in which their policies and practices have furthered and exacerbated discriminatory effects. So the answer to that question is, it is certainly promising that more localities and jurisdictions are considering potential legislative and regulatory action. And at the same time, the majority of proposals that I've seen are still far too reliant upon ineffective and potentially counterproductive bias auditing mechanisms that do not actually address the root causes of or the underlying policies driving adoption and acceleration of algorithmic tools that discriminate.
What comes to mind to me is the lack of diversity in the development, but the people that are developing these algorithms, and if they truly major employers had a more diverse workforce, that would make a difference in terms of who might have some say in the development and the use of these types of tools. I'm curious whether there's any initiative to bring more software developers with disabilities into this professional realm.
Certainly, supporting and elevating disabled people in software development is a necessary and important goal, and one that could significantly alleviate the problem of development of technological tools that are at best inaccessible for people with disabilities, and at worst explicitly perpetrating harmful and dangerous discriminatory impact. At the same time, there are still questions that companies need to answer for, such as, are you hiring disabled people solely to create the superficial appearance of inclusion without allowing for disabled people to also be decision makers around what kinds of tools you are developing, what the goals and objectives of those tools are, what kinds of tools you should perhaps not be developing, and leading the process rather than being brought on at the end of a development and research process, as is often the case when people from marginalized communities are asked to provide input. And again, there is also a need not only to increase the amount of support and room for disabled people in developing technology, but there's also a need for companies, again, that are now already deploying algorithm-based tools or are thinking of adopting those tools to ask themselves the hard questions of why it is they want to use those tools in the first place, what objectives those tools are accomplishing, and whether those are objectives that are worthwhile, or whether those are objectives that can, in fact, be in alignment with purported goals of commitment to diversity and inclusion.
Let's broaden this conversation outside this particular arena to broader construct of there's so many different areas that the disability community is working on to try to improve employment opportunity, career advancement, even the very nature of safe environments for self-disclosure, self-identification. As an individual who has been described as a person unafraid to push boundaries, as really one of the true new generation of leaders in the disability community, certainly in policy development. What's an example of a policy arena you believe should be at the top of the list of policy change that would really break new ground to advance employment and economic self-sufficiency for individuals with disabilities?
This is a really tricky question to answer, in part because I see it as having two parts, right? And one major issue area are the ways in which disabled people are currently precluded from participation in the economic mainstream and are currently prevented from even having anything close to an equal opportunity to obtain and maintain economic stability. And the second area are questions that I would argue are much broader than mere economic stability. And they're questions about economic freedom and the ability to be the ability to experience economic self-determination, right? And so in the first part of these questions, I believe that one of the most urgent issues impacting disabled people now are the twin policy realities of enforced impoverishment through the ways in which means-tested public benefits programs that many people with disabilities have to rely upon, if for no other reason than because of discrimination that forces disabled people out of the workforce and out of opportunities for educational advancement, and of need for access to certain types of support and services that are only really accessible through Medicaid, for example. And that enforced impoverishment shows up because of asset limits and income limits that impact disabled people's ability to maintain any amount of economic security in order to be able to access programs that in large part require disabled people to stay trapped in a cycle of poverty. And then at the same time, the extremely outsized and disproportionate burden of debt that disabled people carry because of medical debt, because of debt that is traceable directly to consequences of disability and failed social services policies, because of debt accrued related to chronic and underemployment, because of debt related to student loans, of which there is a gross need for overhaul and reform immediately, like yesterday, like last year. And those realities severely set people with disabilities back. Even those people with disabilities who are able to work and earn an income, we know, because NDI has calculated, need on average more than 20% income than non-disabled people to maintain the same standard of living. And that's on average. There are many people with disabilities who, because of their own disability-related needs and the expenses that come about because of existing as a disabled person, and perhaps those of other members of their household who also have disabilities, might be earning what for a non-disabled person would be a solidly middle-class salary, but in reality are still living paycheck to paycheck and relying on predatory debt products in order to stay afloat and to at least avoid going into collections and to avoid declaring bankruptcy. And that's not sustainable. Someone should not, nobody should be trapped in a cycle of poverty, no matter who they are and what their ability to work is. But even in our present society, someone shouldn't be earning what is supposed to be a middle-class salary and nonetheless still relegated to the economic margins. That should not be happening. And yet that disproportionately happens for people with disabilities. On the second question, the second area that I mentioned, about achieving economic freedom, I think that there are questions that we can't even begin to ask or answer without addressing the immediate crises of that first area. But I want to know, and I advocate for, what a future would be for people with disabilities to not have to rely upon a patchwork of poorly regulated and often not well enforced protections around access to credit, around the ability to build assets, around the ability to access public benefits, around the ability to access social services, around the ability to bring in enforcement action for discriminatory behavior in housing or employment, for example. What would it mean for people with disabilities to have the same range of choices for short-term and long-term planning that non-disabled people have? It shouldn't be the case that people with disabilities have to worry about, well, what if I'm going to need long-term care for the vast majority of my adult life, and non-disabled people don't have to prepare for that financial catastrophe? Or what about when disabled people have to say, well, in order to maintain assets, to be able to say, save up for a vacation that I've dreamed of going on, or potentially save for a down payment toward a house where I grew up, that you have to justify your expenses if you have your assets, if you were fortunate enough to place them in an ABLE account, or if you have more assets than could be placed in an ABLE account because of the annual contribution limit and the overall asset limit on an ABLE account itself, you have to open a special needs trust or contribute to a pooled trust where you no longer have control and autonomy over your funds and your assets. But a non-disabled person who wants to save up to do the very same things doesn't have to worry about what type of instrument they're placing their funds in, whether they need to relinquish control over it, and whether they need to artificially limit the amount of money that they can earn, as well as the amount of money that they can put aside, and potentially have to document every single purpose for which they are using or expending those funds. A non-disabled person is not limited in the ways that a disabled person who currently needs access to public benefits is. And so the question of economic freedom within our present regulatory scheme is out of reach for the most marginalized and impoverished people with disabilities.
You lay out multiple issues that I would completely agree with you at the top of the list. How in the world our patchwork system of rules and laws actually perpetuate poverty for individuals with disabilities, lack of enforcement across the not just civil rights in a narrow context, but in the broader context, major issues. When you look ahead, we're coming up to, it's hard to believe, but the 33rd anniversary of the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I'll just ask you this final question. Some things have changed. Technology has been a great innovator, although we've spent a major part of this conversation on technology inhibiting the continued growth and advancement economically of individuals with disabilities. What's the future look like to you and to the next generation of people with disabilities born at either at the time the ADA was passed or have new generations that have been born since? What's your view of how do we change this what is deeply endemic cultural bias, historical bias of discrimination related to disabled people?
That is a huge question, Michael, and we're not going to be able to fully address it in one podcast, or probably not even in 10 podcasts. I don't think that's likely to happen. But the question you pose, I would argue, again, is an invitation to return to the need for both the disability rights movement and the disability justice movement. We know that our current legal schemata is not enough. It's not sufficient. Disabled people still face an unemployment rate about twice that of non-disabled people, and it's higher when you disaggregate by race. Disabled people face a poverty rate that is higher than that of non-disabled people. We face diminished lifetime earnings compared to non-disabled people. Disability non-discrimination laws have not lifted every single disabled person out of poverty, right? And as we were talking about a few minutes ago, I would argue that our current social services system and our social policy forces many disabled people to remain trapped in poverty. And so I think it is self-evident that our laws and policies are not sufficient right now to address the most urgent and pressing needs of disabled people, especially those who are at the margins of the margins. And at the same time, as we need to strengthen, amend, and actually support meaningful enforcement action in our laws and our policies, there is also much work to be done that transcends the world of law and policy, that is past the ability and outside the realm of this conversation, right? To be able to achieve, like even if every single employer were meaningfully committed to reducing disability discrimination in their recruitment and hiring and retention processes and policies, that's not going to change the fact that in our country right now, access to employment often predicates the ability to access robust health care, the ability to have housing stability, and to know that you have a roof over your head and don't have to worry about it, the ability to be able to independently build assets if you are employed at sufficiently high wages or salary, rather than to have to exist in a financially segregated system where you are subjected to greater surveillance and paternalism. You shouldn't have to be able to prove that you can work in a certain way 35 or more hours a week in order to be able to be assured that you will be able to be housed, that you will be able to access services and support and not have to worry about it, that you will be able to live a self-determined life. But in our society, that is the reality, right? And similarly, you shouldn't have to be someone born into wealth to be able to have it guaranteed that you will have control over the services, support, and care that you might need, versus to live with precarious at best care and services. But the reality is, if you are not born into wealth or do not achieve a substantial income in your lifetime, which is much less probable for most people with disabilities anyway, then you'll not be able to exercise that autonomy, that self-determination, and therefore the assurance of a positive quality of life as defined by you. So there are immediate and pressing concerns on the legislative and regulatory side that we absolutely can and should address to fix some of these gaps, to improve the landscape of disability law, of civil rights enforcement. And at the same time, there are broader societal questions that just transcend our ability to address them in the span of the next 5-10 minutes.
Lydia, I cannot overstate my sense of your vision, your values that come through, your continued role as an activist. We have had, as you said, a conversation that's just the beginning of what could spend hours and hours to try to get at deeper at some of these critical issues. Thank you for your advice, your insights, and appreciate what you're doing and with the many organizations that you work with, changing a world of bias and discrimination, and certainly not happening overnight, but we're continuing to make progress. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for hosting me. It's been a pleasure having this conversation with you, Michael, and I'm sure we'll have many more to come.
You've been listening to Let's Get to Work, Reimagining Disability Inclusive Employment Policy, brought to you by the Burton Blatt Institute at Syracuse University. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. The contents of this podcast were developed under a grant from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, NIDLR Grant Number 90RTEM0006. NIDLR is a center within the Administration for Community Living, ACL, Department of Health and Human Services, HHS. The contents of this podcast do not necessarily represent the policy of NIDLR, ACL, or HHS, and you should not assume endorsement by the federal government.